What does it actually take to become the biggest band on the planet? Talent, sure. Timing, maybe. But what about everything that gets quietly buried along the way? BTS has sold over 40 million albums, filled stadiums on 6 continents, and built a fan base so loyal it has its own name, ARMY. Hybe, the company behind them, is worth billions. And like any billion-dollar machine, it runs on a very carefully managed image. But image management isn't just about what you show, it's about what you don't. Behind 7 of the most photographed faces in modern music, there are stories that were downplayed, timed, filtered, or kept in a drawer until the moment they couldn't be anymore. Not scandals manufactured for clicks, real things. Health crises treated like scheduling conflicts, personal decisions framed as company announcements, creative frustrations smoothed over with choreography. The gap between what ARMY was told and what was actually happening is wider than most people realize. This isn't a hit piece, it's a closer look at what the machinery behind BTS chose not to put in the press release, and why that matters. Number 7. The invisible injury, Suga. For years, Min Yoongi performed on one of the most physically demanding stages in the world, full concerts, high-energy choreography, hours of rehearsal, while carrying a shoulder injury that was far more serious than anything Hybe ever officially framed as a medical issue. The injury dated back to a car accident Suga was involved in before his debut, when he was working part-time as a delivery worker to help support his family while training. That accident damaged his left shoulder. He has spoken about it himself in interviews and in his own documentary content, describing the chronic pain it caused. But what Hybe never made fully transparent to the public was how extensively that injury affected BTS's touring schedule and Suga's physical capacity throughout the group's peak years of activity. During the Map of the Soul era, which collapsed due to COVID, Suga underwent shoulder surgery in November 2020. Hybe announced it. What they did not emphasize, and what took considerably longer to surface, was that the surgery was a significant rotator cuff repair, not a minor procedure. Rotator cuff surgeries typically require 6 months to a full year of genuine rehabilitation before a patient returns to full physical activity. The kind of full physical activity that BTS's performance schedule demands is not what most post-surgical rehabilitation plans are designed around. Yet, within months, Suga was back in promotional content, and the severity of what he had gone through was packaged and moved past with the kind of speed that suggests the priority was the schedule, not the recovery. What makes this more pointed is Suga's own character. He is famously private, famously stoic, and by his own admission, someone who does not easily show vulnerability or ask for rest. In his August D documentary released through Weverse in 2023, he spoke with unusual candor about the emotional and physical weight he had been carrying, not just the shoulder, but the psychological cost of years of suppression. He described crying alone, feeling disconnected, struggling with the performance of being okay. These were not things Hybe amplified. They existed in content that required fans to seek it out, not in any official statement or press communication that treated his well-being as something the public deserved to know about in real time. There is also the matter of his 2023 mandatory military enlistment, which he served in the social service worker category rather than as an active duty soldier, a decision that was made on medical grounds related to his shoulder. The announcement was made with minimal elaboration. The gap between he is serving in social service and his shoulder injury from before debut is the documented medical reason this was the appropriate path was never bridged by Hybe in any public-facing communication. ARMY filled in the context themselves, as they often do. Suga is one of the most critically respected figures in Korean hip-hop, a songwriter with production credits that extend beyond BTS, a man who built his public persona from almost nothing in Daegu, and someone whose artistic output has been consistently more autobiographical and raw than most of what the group's label would have preferred to put front and center. The injury is not a tragedy, but the way it was managed, quietly, efficiently, with the group's momentum always in the foreground, tells you something true about how Hybe weighs a person against a product. Number 6. The mixtape they tried to keep small, RM. Kim Namjoon released his first mixtape under the name RM in 2015. It was free, it was self-distributed through SoundCloud, it contained lyrics that were direct, politically aware, and, in places, genuinely confrontational, the kind of content that sat at a significant distance from the clean, synchronized, brand-safe image that Big Hit Entertainment, which later became Hybe, was carefully constructing around BTS at the time. The mixtape addressed social inequality, the pressure of Korean academic culture, identity, and the psychological cost of chasing success inside a system that crushes most people who try. It was, by any honest measure, more artistically raw than anything BTS was releasing as a group at that point. And Hybe's response to it was not celebration, it was tolerance with a very short leash. The label did not promote the mixtape. There was no press release, no coordinated rollout, no official merchandising, no streaming push. It existed because Namjoon put it out himself, and taking it down would have caused more damage than leaving it up. That is a meaningful distinction. Passive permission is not the same as support. For a label that controlled virtually every other aspect of BTS's public output, the photo shoots, the interview talking points, the choreography, the social media cadence, the silence around RM's solo work was not accidental, it was a calculated distance. What makes this particularly significant is what the mixtape represented in context. BTS was, at that moment, a mid-tier group fighting for survival in an industry where dozens of groups debut and disappear within 2 years. Big Hit was not a large label. It did not have the financial cushion that SM or YG had. Every move BTS made was scrutinized internally for how it affected their commercial viability. A leader who was putting out politically tinged hip-hop that referenced social criticism was a variable the label had not planned for and did not know how to monetize. So they did not try. They waited to see whether it would become a problem. It did not become a problem. It became the foundation of RM's credibility. The Korean hip-hop community, which had been skeptical of idol rappers almost as a default position, took notice. International listeners who discovered BTS through the mixtape arrived with a different relationship to the group, one built on his actual artistic voice rather than the group's commercial output. That audience became part of the core of what ARMY grew into. Hybe benefited enormously from something it had strategically ignored. The pattern repeated itself. His second mixtape, Mono, released in 2018, was again not a formal Hybe production. It was quieter, more introspective, more literary. It referenced Korean poets, explored loneliness, and moved at a pace completely counter to the maximalist production of BTS's Stadium era. It debuted on the Billboard 200 despite having no physical release, no music video budget, and no label promotional infrastructure behind it. Hybe acknowledged it, they did not lead with it. Namjoon has spoken in his own words about the tension between his individual artistic identity and the group's commercial machine. Carefully, because he is careful, but clearly enough that the picture is not ambiguous. He is a reader, a thinker, a person who visits contemporary art museums alone on his days off, and has donated privately to causes including gender equality initiatives in Korea. The version of RM that Hybe consistently presented to the public was the leader, the translator, the spokesperson, articulate, stable, responsible. The version that existed in his solo work was more complicated, more searching, and considerably more interesting. The label knew which versions sold merchandise. Number 5. The panic attack nobody announced. Jin. Kim Sok-jin is the oldest member of BTS, the one the group calls their eldest hyung, and for the better part of a decade he occupied a very specific role in the machine, the handsome one, the funny one, the emotionally stable anchor who deflected tension with a joke and never appeared to crack under pressure. Hybe leaned into that image with remarkable consistency. Jin was the visual, the comedian, the member whose sold-out Cooking V lives and dad jokes generated enormous engagement with minimal controversy. He was, from a label management perspective, the lowest maintenance member of the group. And that image, while not entirely false, was incomplete in ways that took years to surface properly. In 2022, Jin gave an interview in which he disclosed that he had experienced panic attacks, not one incident framed as an anomaly, a pattern, something he had been dealing with, something that had affected him during a period when BTS was operating at the absolute peak of their commercial intensity. The years between 2017 and 2022 were the years of Love Yourself, Map of the Soul, Dynamite, Butter, Permission to Dance, a sustained commercial explosion that required the group to be simultaneously producing, promoting, touring when possible, maintaining constant social media presence, and functioning as cultural ambassadors for an entire country. The Korean government gave BTS members special exemptions from mandatory military service during this period, specifically because their economic and cultural contribution was deemed nationally significant. That is not a small amount of pressure to place on 7 human beings. Jin's disclosure about panic attacks was not accompanied by any Hybe BTS statement, any acknowledgement that the group's schedule had contributed to that psychological stress, or any structural change in how the members' mental health was publicly discussed. It surfaced in the context of a personal interview, was briefly acknowledged by fans, and then was absorbed into the general narrative of BTS being hardworking and dedicated. The framing around it was never allowed to become a conversation about what the label's demands had cost him personally. What makes Jin's specific situation worth examining more closely is the military question. He was the first BTS member to enlist, entering the army in December 2022 after the South Korean government ultimately did not grant the group a permanent exemption from mandatory military service. Before his enlistment, Jin made a series of public statements and produced solo content that, when read carefully, reflected someone processing a significant psychological transition. His solo single released before enlistment was melancholic in a way that was notably different from his public persona. He spoke in interviews about wanting to be remembered, about what legacy meant to him, about uncertainty. These were not the statements of someone whose inner life matched the cheerful, untroubled image Hybe had spent years building around him. The label's management of Jin's image had always prioritized his accessibility over his depth. He is, by multiple accounts, including his own, someone who thinks carefully and feels things with more weight than the windshield wiper laugh and the broad physical comedy suggested. The panic attacks were real. The pressure that produced them was real, and the decision to keep his public profile firmly in the lane of levity and warmth, regardless of what was happening underneath, was not Jin's alone to make. He completed his military service and was discharged in June 2024. The transition back into public life was managed with the same careful brand continuity that characterized everything before it. What happened inside the years of pressure that preceded that enlistment remains, in any official Hybe BTS communication, essentially untouched. Number 4. The depression behind the smile. J-Hope. Jung Hoseok is, by design and by nature, the member most associated with energy. His stage name is literally a statement of intent, hope. His role within BTS was codified early as the mood maker, the one who kept the atmosphere positive, the one who arrived at rehearsals loudest and left last. Hybe understood exactly what that persona was worth. In a group that dealt in emotional connection, with a fan base that was often young, often lonely, and often looking for something to hold on to, Hoseok's relentless brightness was not just a personality trait, it was a product. It was consistent, it was marketable, and it was protected with the same energy that protected every other revenue-generating aspect of the BTS brand. Which is what makes what he eventually disclosed so significant. In the BTS documentary content released through their own channels and in interviews conducted around the time of his solo album Jack in the Box in 2022, Hoseok spoke about experiencing depression, not a passing low period framed in vague terms, actual depression, something he described as genuinely dark, something that existed in direct contrast to the image he had been projecting for years on behalf of the group. Jack in the Box itself was a deliberate dismantling of the J-Hope persona. The production was abrasive, the visuals were unsettling, the lyrical content addressed internal conflict, duality, and the psychological cost of being someone else's symbol of happiness. It was the artistic equivalent of a person finally saying something they had been holding for a long time. Hybe released the album. They did not, however, build any public narrative around what it represented personally for Hoseok. There was no conversation initiated at the label level about what years of performing relentless positivity had cost him psychologically. The album was marketed as a creative pivot, an artistic exploration, a bold new direction. The personal confession embedded within it was left for fans to decode on their own. This matters because the J-Hope persona was not incidental. It was a deliberate construction that served the group's emotional ecosystem. BTS's internal dynamic was publicly framed as 7 members with distinct roles: the leader, the genius, the visuals, the hope. That framework made the group legible to new fans and gave ARMY a structured way to connect with each member individually. But frameworks have costs. When your assigned role is hope, the pressure to never publicly contradict that role is institutional, not just personal. Hoseok carried that pressure for the better part of a decade before his solo work gave him a sanctioned space to set it down. His 2023 military enlistment, in which he chose to enlist as an active duty soldier rather than take the social service route available to him, was widely noted for its voluntariness and was framed publicly as a patriotic and personal decision. What received less attention was the timing. He enlisted shortly after releasing the most psychologically honest work of his career, at a moment when the group had effectively paused, at a point when stepping away from the machine was perhaps not only a civic obligation, but a genuine relief. He has not said that explicitly, but the sequence of events is not subtle. Hoseok returned from military service in October 2024. His public reception was enormous. The smile was back. Whether the depression is gone, whether the structural conditions that produced it have changed, whether Hybe has meaningfully reconsidered what it asks of a person it has built an entire emotional brand around, none of that was addressed in any official capacity. The product was restored. The conversation about maintaining that product had cost was never started. Number 3. The contract crisis they rebranded as a hiatus, Jimin. Park Jimin has consistently ranked as one of the most streamed and most searched members of BTS globally. His solo debut album Face, released in March 2023, made him the first Korean solo artist to debut at number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100, with the single Like Crazy. That is not a minor achievement. That is a chart record with real commercial and cultural weight behind it. Hybe's response to that milestone was measured, coordinated, and press release smooth. What the label did not discuss publicly, and what required considerable independent reporting and fan community documentation to piece together, was the degree to which Jimin's solo trajectory had been subject to internal friction long before that album existed. The broader context requires understanding what happened to BTS as a unit in 2022. In June of that year, the group published a video on their official Hybe-managed channel, in which several members, including Jimin, became visibly emotional while discussing exhaustion, creative stagnation, and uncertainty about their direction as a group. The video was framed by Hybe's communications infrastructure as a candid moment of reflection. What it actually represented, read against subsequent events, was a group of people communicating distress through the only channel available to them that was still technically within the approved content ecosystem. They could not hold a press conference. They could not give unmediated interviews. They could speak into a camera on their own platform and trust that their audience would understand what was being said between the lines. Jimin's specific situation within that period was complicated by the fact that his solo ambitions had been developing for years inside a structure that prioritized the group's collective output above individual members' artistic timelines. Multiple members have acknowledged in various contexts that solo projects required navigation within Hybe's approval and resource allocation system. That you did not simply decide to make a solo album and make one. You worked within a process. For some members, that process was relatively aligned with their artistic instincts. For others, the gap between what they wanted to create and what the label was prepared to support was wider and more frustrating. Face, when it finally arrived, bore the marks of someone who had been waiting to say something specific for a long time. The album dealt directly with identity fragmentation, with the experience of losing yourself inside a collective persona, with the question of who you are when the performance stops. These are not abstract artistic themes for a man who debuted as a teenager and spent his entire adult life inside one of the most intensively managed image systems in the global music industry. The album was personal in a way that Hybe's promotional framing consistently softened, presenting it as artistic growth rather than psychological excavation. The timing of Jimin's military enlistment in December 2023, alongside Jungkook, came at a point when questions about Hybe's relationship with its artists had become significantly more public. The broader Hybe crisis of 2024, which involved serious internal conflicts with the label and other artists on its roster, public accusations of surveillance and psychological manipulation, and a National Assembly audit, cast retroactive light on the environment in which BTS had been operating for years. Jimin did not make public statements about internal label dynamics during this period. He did not need to. The structure of what had been withheld was becoming legible through other means. What Hybe never acknowledged directly was that the 2022 announcement of BTS's group hiatus to pursue solo activities, framed as a natural creative evolution, a healthy pause, a planned chapter, arrived after a period of internal tension that the label had every institutional incentive to keep invisible. The rebranding of what was, by multiple indicators, a moment of genuine crisis into a scheduled and orderly transition was one of the cleaner pieces of narrative management Hybe has ever executed. Jimin's tears on camera were real. The press release that followed was something else entirely.
Number 2. The lawsuit they hoped you'd forget. V. Kim Tae-young occupies a particular position within the BTS constellation. He is the member whose off-duty aesthetic sensibility, the art books, the vintage cameras, the jazz records, the deliberate distance from idol convention, built him a secondary identity as something closer to a cultural figure than a pop product. Hybe understood the commercial value of that image and worked with it carefully, allowing Taeyoung's perceived authenticity to function as a differentiating asset while ensuring it never drifted far enough from the group's brand architecture to become a liability. For years, that balance held. Then, a lawsuit made the management of his personal life significantly harder to contain. In 2023, Taeyoung became publicly linked to Jennie Kim of Blackpink through a series of leaked photographs. The leak itself was a significant privacy violation, private images obtained and distributed without consent. But the story that followed the leak revealed something more structurally interesting than a celebrity relationship. What emerged through Korean media reporting and subsequent legal proceedings was that the leak was connected to individuals who had accessed private data through means that raised serious questions about digital security and the surveillance infrastructure surrounding top-tier Korean celebrities. Hybe and YG Entertainment, the label behind Blackpink, both moved quickly to contain the narrative. Legal action was initiated, statements were made about privacy protection. What neither label addressed publicly was the broader implications sitting underneath the legal response, that the private lives of their artists were being actively monitored, that the information environment surrounding these individuals was porous in ways that suggested systemic vulnerability rather than an isolated incident, and that the label's primary concern in responding was reputational management rather than a genuine reckoning with what their artists' lives actually looked like outside the controlled content ecosystem. The lawsuit targeted the leakers. It did not produce any public conversation about why private images of their own artists were accessible in the first place. Taeyoung's relationship with Jennie was never officially confirmed by either label during the period when it was active. This was entirely consistent with Hybe's long-standing approach to BTS members' personal relationships, which operated under a framework of strategic ambiguity, neither confirming nor denying, maintaining the parasocial accessibility that drives merchandise sales and fan engagement metrics, while avoiding the measurable fan base attrition that confirmed relationships sometimes produce. That framework is not unique to Hybe. It is standard operating procedure across the Korean entertainment industry, but it placed Taeyoung in a position where a genuine relationship in his personal life existed entirely outside any sanctioned public narrative, which meant that when it became public through a privacy violation, he had no prepared language for addressing it, and no label infrastructure willing to stand beside him and treat it as a normal human event. The 2024 Hybe internal crisis added another layer to Taeyoung's specific situation. During the period when Hybe's conflicts with other roster artists became public and the label's internal communications were being scrutinized at a level that included National Assembly involvement, documents surfaced that described monitoring practices applied to BTS members' personal communications and relationships. The framing within those documents, according to reporting from that period, treated the members' private lives as variables to be managed in service of brand stability. Taeyoung was among the members whose personal associations were discussed in terms of their commercial impact rather than their human significance. He enlisted in the military in December 2023 and was discharged in June 2025. Throughout his service, he maintained a public profile that was warm, grounded, and conspicuously free of any engagement with the institutional questions that had accumulated around Hybe during his absence. Whether that restraint was personal preference or managed positioning is a question the label has never been required to answer publicly. The lawsuit resolved quietly. The structural conditions that made it possible were never examined out loud. Number 1. The mental breakdown Hybe turned into a concept. Jungkook. Jungkook is the youngest member of BTS, the one who was recruited by Big Hit at the age of 13 and spent the years that most people use to develop an identity inside a trainee system designed to replace personal development with performance readiness. He debuted at 15. By the time he was 20, he was one of the most recognized faces on the planet. By 25, he had spent more of his life inside the BTS machine than outside it. That biographical fact alone carries weight that Hybe has never once addressed in any official capacity, because addressing it honestly would require the label to reckon with what it means to hand a child to an industry and call the result a success story. The surface narrative around Jungkook has always been the golden maknae, a label the group itself uses affectionately, meaning the youngest who excels at everything: singing, dancing, athletics, visual appeal. The framing is one of natural gifts channeled into extraordinary achievement. What sits underneath that framing, and what gradually became impossible to fully conceal, is a picture of someone who reached his mid-20s without having had a single sustained period of life that was not structured entirely around his value as a commercial product. In 2019, Jungkook was involved in a minor car accident in which he rear-ended another vehicle. The incident was reported, handled legally, and Hybe issued a statement. What the statement did not address was the context. Jungkook was driving alone late at night in circumstances that prompted genuine concern among people paying attention. The incident was managed as a traffic matter. The question of what a 21-year-old under that magnitude of pressure was doing alone in a car late at night, and what his actual psychological state looked like during that period, was never raised in any official communication. That same period, roughly 2018 to 2020, corresponds to what BTS members have collectively and individually described as one of their most grueling stretches, the Love Yourself and Map of the Soul era, which produced some of their most commercially successful work while simultaneously pushing the members to a documented breaking point. The 2022 video in which members discussed exhaustion and uncertainty referenced this period directly. Jungkook, in that video, was among the most visibly affected. He struggled to articulate what he was feeling. He cried. Hybe uploaded it, titled it, and let ARMY process it as content. That is the mechanism worth examining most carefully at the top of this list. The label developed a practice, refined over years, of allowing genuine psychological distress to surface through controlled content formats, the V-Lives, the documentaries, the behind-the-scenes footage, where it could be received by fans as intimacy and authenticity rather than as evidence of institutional failure. Jungkook's visible struggles were never hidden in the crude sense of the word, they were reframed. Vulnerability became a content category. Pain became a narrative device that deepened fan connection and therefore deepened commercial value. The breakdown was not concealed, it was produced. His solo album, Golden, released in November 2023, shortly before his military enlistment, contained within it a body of work that was sonically polished and emotionally surface-level in a way that stood in sharp contrast to what fans had witnessed from him in less managed formats. The album performed enormously well commercially. It said very little about what was actually happening inside the person who made it. That gap between the managed product and the observable human being is the most precise summary of what Hybe has been doing across all 7 members for the better part of a decade. Jungkook enlisted in December 2023 and was discharged in June 2025, the same month as Taehyung. BTS is expected to reunite as a complete group in 2025. Hybe's stock price responded to that announcement. The members' responses, in the carefully worded statements released through official channels, expressed gratitude and excitement. Somewhere between the stock price and the press release is the actual story of 7 people who gave their youth to a machine and are only now in their late 20s and early 30s beginning to have enough distance from it to understand what that cost them. Hybe has never been asked to answer for that publicly. Based on their track record, they are not planning to start.